So we're in the book of Hebrews. It has some reflection on eternity and looking past to the past of ancient Israel and how they didn't benefit by their reaction to God entering his rest, which would be there, the promised land. The first generation died out. And the second generation finally made an attempt but didn't quite hold to the promised land and made lots of mistakes. And so we still don't have Israel entering its rest, by which God decreed Israel would be the chosen people of God. No longer is it these generations as they passed on by and through most of the church age. But God made a promise, and Israel will enter her rest, though that particular generation of Israel, Jeremiah 31:31 to 34, house of Israel, house of Jacob, which will then all turn to Jesus Christ, believe in him, be transformed by him, unilaterally by Jesus, into perfect human beings living hundreds of years, knowing the Word of God perfectly, and co-ruling with him over the nations of the world, the Gentile nations. That's going to be amazing. God's fulfilling his promise. All these centuries, though, allowing Israel to participate, and they miserably failed. What about the church age? Has it miserably failed or succeeded? I'd say the former, not the latter. Hebrews 3:16, 4 to 11, Expositor's Bible Commentary on Hebrews 3:16, 4 to 11. 3:16, for who provoked him when they had heard? Indeed, did not all those who came out of Egypt, led by Moses? The author presses home his point by three questions that emphasize that it was the people who were in a position of spiritual privilege and yet sinned grievously, who were in mind in Psalm 95. Some scholars, it is true, take times that Greek word rendered some or who, for who provoked him, as the indefinite pronoun and not as an interrogative, as does the King James Version, for some did provoke. But some is a strange designation for practically the whole nation, and in any case it is better to see the same construction in all three of these verses. The first question then asks, who were they who heard and rebelled? The verb rebelled is found only here in the New Testament, though a cognate noun occurs in verse 8. It means embitter, make angry, and is a strong expression for the rebellious attitude that characterized the Exodus generation. Now the writer answers his question with another, the one phrase, so as to expect the answer yes. All those Moses led out of Egypt is comprehensive, but that Joshua and Caleb are not mentioned does not invalidate the argument. The nation was characterized by unbelief, and the faithfulness of two men does not alter this. NIV says that Moses led the people out of Egypt, but more literally, the author said that they came out through Moses, implying that they acted on their own volition and made a good start. Hebrews 3:17, and with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? 17. The second question refers to those God was angry with those 40 years. For the anger of God, see comments on verses 10 and 11. In the earlier treatment of the incident, the 40 years referred to testing God and seeing his works. Here it refers to the continuing wrath of God, as in Hebrews and in Septuagint on this issue. The wrath of God was not something transitory and easily avoided. It lasted throughout the wilderness period. Wow. The question, was it not, employs the emphatic uchi found in only one other place in this epistle. Its use leaves no doubt whatever that God was angry with the sinners in question. Well, he gave them a lot of time. Their punishment is mentioned in words taken from or reminiscent of Numbers 14:29 and 32. The author may be quoting, or he may simply be using scriptural language to add solemnity to his point. He reminds his readers that in the past those who sinned against God had been destroyed, and indeed, as the verbs in Numbers passage are future, since they were spoken before the event, that they were destroyed as it was prophesied. The word rendered desert refers to desert refers to deserted land. It is wilderness country, in contrast to cultivated and inhabited land. It can be used for pasture. Here it is the uninhabited area the Israelites passed through on their wanderings. They didn't have much to wander through. Bare land, uninhabited areas. Hebrews 3:18, and to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? The third question refers to those to whom the oath was sworn. Those who would not enter the God's rest were those who disobeyed. The verb, which means properly disobey, but some accept the meaning of disbelieve. You have some passages where the gospel is presented, and then people disobeyed the gospel. Well, all they had to do was believe it. So disobey the gospel means to disbelieve it, and other things too. Disbelieve a command. This is possible since for the early Christians, the supreme disobedience was a refusal to believe their gospel. But here it seems that we should take the meaning disobey. God did much for these people, yet in the end they went their own way and refused to obey him. Amazing. To get to know God firsthand, rescuing you from Egypt, and then you went your own way. Hebrews 3:19. So we see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief. The depressing conclusion sums up what has gone before. The author does not say that they did not enter, but that they were not able to enter. Sin is self-defeating, and unbelief of itself prevents us from entering God's rest. This is not an arbitrary penalty imposed on by a despotic God. It is the inevitable, look out, 40 years. It is the inevitable outcome of unbelief. In the Greek, the final word in this section of the argument, thrown to the end of the sentence for greater emphasis, is apistia, unbelief. Sounds like apostasia? Right. That is what robbed the wilderness generation of the rest they had every reason to expect when they came out of Egypt. The warning to the people of the writer's day is clear. To slip back from their Christian profession into unbelief would be fatal, and they lost their lives in the desert. Did not enter the promised land because they outright refused. Hebrews 4:1. Christians enter the rest. 4:1-10. Now the author of Hebrews argues that the purposes of God are not frustrated because Israel of old disobeyed him and failed to enter the rest he had promised his people. The promise remains. If the ancient Israelites did not enter God's rest, then someone else will, namely the Christians. Here's my comment. No! A future generation of Israel will enter God's rest in fulfillment of the new covenant. Because the new covenant, Jeremiah 31:31-34, is not between God and Israel and the church. It's between the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Let me show you. A while back I finally did a study on these passages that refer to God's promise to Israel. Jeremiah 31:31-34. Key passage. Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord. They haven't come yet, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Sound like the church? Which is the church? The house of Israel or the house of Judah? not like the covenant which I made with their fathers on the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. Is that the church? No. My covenant, which they broke, the law, covenant of the Mosaic law, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. He will do the transforming. They will not teach again each man his neighbor, and each man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least of them, to the greatest of them, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more. Second coming of Christ. All that generation at that time, yet future, very close, will believe in Jesus, and these transformations will take part. And they will become the priesthood, co-ruling with Christ over the nations of the Gentiles on the planet. According to God's decree, sovereignty, and promise, these things will happen. Otherwise, God and His Word, the Bible, is seriously flawed. His promises are not trustworthy. He's not saying, well, Israel didn't work out, I'll switch it over to the church. And so many Christians think that that's the issue. How could God promise it over and over and over again? The whole so-called Old Testament. Israel, working with Israel. They failed, bringing her back. Babylon, and so on. Oh, I give it up. I'll give it to the church. But this should not lead to complacency. If the Israelites of an earlier day, with all their advantages, failed to enter the rest, Christians ought not to think there will be automatic acceptance for them. They must take care lest they too fail to enter the blessing. Most, sad to say, in the church age have failed. They're not interested in eternal rewards. Christians have another destiny, one of their own, as part of the body of Christ, not as priests of the nations of the world, but of co-rulership with Christ over the universe. Hebrews 4:1. Therefore, let us fear if, while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. NIV says, let us be careful, is more strictly let us fear, and the exhortation comes first in the sentence. It is emphatic because the writer does not want his readers to be complacent. There is real danger. God's promises mean much to the writer. We're talking about the Hebrew Christians now, and all Christians. And indeed, the word rendered promise occurs more often in Hebrews than in any other New Testament book, 14 times. The promise in question still stands. That is to say, though it has not been fulfilled, it has not been revoked. In one sense, of course, there was a fulfillment for the generation after the men who died in the wilderness entered Canaan. But throughout this section, it is basic to the argument that physical entry into Canaan did not constitute the fulfillment of the promise. Entrance, just then their trouble begins. Their testing begins. God had promised rest, and that meant more than living in Canaan. They had their problems. There is a problem about the word translated be found. The verb is dokio, which means think, suppose, if transitive, and seems, and have the appearance of, or if intransitive. Moffat points out that a meaning like judge, adjudge, is also tested in some passages in Josephus, Septuagint, and Attic. There are two main possibilities. The one accepts think as the meaning and sees the writer as reassuring fearful Christians who thought they might miss the rest. The earlier generation had missed it, and why should not they? The other interpretations prefers seem to be judged or be found, and takes the words as a warning to the readers to take care lest they miss the promised rest. Seem is a way of softening the warning so that the writer refrains from saying that any of them actually missed or will miss the promise. The decision is not easy, but on the whole it seems that the second interpretation fits the context better. The author then is reminding his readers that there was a generation to whom the rest was promised and who missed it. They should be aware lest they make the same mistake. Christians will miss their promise of rewards in heaven and make the same mistake as previous generations of Christians, just like the old Israelites did. And now we're waiting for that generation, the last one, the last second when Christ comes again. That generation at the end of the tribulation period will see Jesus, and all will believe in him. And now we have the new covenant. For indeed we have had good news preached to us, just as they also